Thank you so much for inviting me to address you this evening. I am so thrilled and pleased to be here. I am the co-founder of a company called Futerra. And Futerra was founded in 2001 with the purpose of imagining better, of trying to think of how the world could be better and helping big companies and governments and charities get us there. We've had an office here in Stockholm since 2000. Where are the Futerrans in the audience? Obviously, the Futerrans are not following the rules. They're sitting on the stairs. It's very much what our company is about. But I'm not going to talk to you about any of the work that we do as a business. I'm going to talk to you about what we think and what I've discovered in 20 years of working in social and environmental sustainability. And I have a very posh English accent. And I also have a cold. So we'll see how those two things come together and how much like a teenage boy my voice sounds by the end of this speech. So imagine better. I'm going to talk to you a lot about this need for positive thinking. But first, I want to start with why. I'm going to show you something called the crisis curve. And the crisis curve looks very similar to what Johan presented earlier with his curves, two curves that went down and one curve that went up. And he and I have come to a very similar graph, but through completely different routes. So Johan's graph was from the science of how do we fit within planetary boundaries and meet the SDGs. My graph comes from the psychology and sociology of change. So psychologists and therapists work with something called the crisis curve, which is what we as individuals go through when we hit a crisis. A crisis in our family, a crisis of health, maybe an addiction, a very serious addictive crisis. And also, this curve comes from sociologists and how they say culture changes. How do we change altogether? There's an extraordinary correlation between how individuals face crisis and how whole societies face crisis. Almost as if collectively we act in the same way that one person would act if they face a problem. And it all starts with changes in normal. Problems brew. We become more aware that we're facing a challenge. We keep doing the same thing, but expecting a different result. Many of us will recognize this from our own lives, and I'm sure we can recognize it from the climate crisis that we're facing. We often hit a crossroads, a meeting of the pathways, a moment of the highest anxiety when we're facing a crisis. For an individual, that might be when a problem has got so bad it can no longer be ignored, that it's beginning to affect their life, their family, their work. You could argue that the latest IPCC report is the crossroads moment, the crisis moment for us on climate change if we're thinking as a society. Now, it's important to note that when we're at a crossroads, we become very open to suggestion. We start breaking out of our common ways of thinking and we start becoming very change-minded. We become change-minded. And we can take very good and very bad decisions when we face a crossroads. When the crisis has built so much, we become very able to choose well and to choose badly. Trump. Don't want to be too political. Bad throat, remember. One of three things happen when we hit a crisis as individuals and in our whole societies. One is disaster. The problems that got us to the crossroads, we don't deal with them. We deny the problem. We try to survive. We blame ourselves, but we don't actually change anything. Disaster. Business as usual. But the most common thing, and the thing that drives psychologists and therapists crazy, is something called maladaptation. Maladaptation, which is where we do make some changes. They're just not the right changes. If we're facing a personal crisis of addiction, maybe we change our addiction from one problem to another. Or if we're thinking about climate change, a maladaptation would be something like geoengineering, where we try to solve the symptoms, but not the cause of our problem. But disaster still comes. And when you think about climate change and the crisis that we're facing with climate change, these two pathways are the pathways which perhaps we hear most about. Small changes we could make to delay disaster, or Mad Max, the absolute crisis in our society. However, when I look at the historical crises that we've faced, and when I look at the psychology of how individuals face crisis, there is a third path out of the crossroads. And it's a path that goes upwards, where we deal with the problems that caused the crisis in the first place, and we come out of it better than we started. Now, for an individual, this might mean dealing with the reasons for their addiction, dealing with the causes of the problem in their family. For us, in terms of climate change, it's nearly impossible to manage that route, but it is there, where we're forced to move to a renewable-based economy and thereby lift 50% of our fellow human beings who don't have access to energy out of energy poverty and reach a place where everybody in humanity could have access to energy. There are so many co-benefits of taking action on climate change. Benefits for our health, benefits for our economy, benefits for the poorest in our societies. That if we deal with the problems that cause climate change, we could come out of this crisis better than we went in. Now, you're probably thinking, what makes the difference? If you're standing at crossroads, is it technology? Is it politics? What is it that means that you come out better or worse? And when you look at the literature, when you look at the psychology and the sociology, there's actually only one thing that can be compared across all the different examples. And it's not anything physical, and it's definitely not anything political. It's emotional and psychological. So in 1928, William Thomas, and actually William and his wife Dorothy Thomas, wrote a book. And there was one sentence in this book, which is, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. And this one sentence went on to be the basis of modern sociology, of how we look at how groups of people interact with each other. You might be more familiar with it with the word self-fulfilling prophecy. The one thing that defines what pathway you take out of the crossroads is which pathway you're facing. If you are facing towards the disaster pathway, if that's what you expect to happen, then that is where your action, your investment, your choices, your behaviours will lead you to. If you are facing towards the positive outcome, if that's what you believe will happen, then that's where your behaviours will take you. As human beings, we have this almost a magical ability to subconsciously act towards what we think an outcome's going to be. And when it comes to climate change, Which ones of those pathways, of those three outcomes, are we facing? Which one are we spending our time talking about, telling each other stories about, writing newspapers articles about? Are we talking about the path downwards or the path upwards? All of our greatest change makers throughout history have known this power. They've known how important it is to face even unimaginable odds with hope and positivity. Whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. Believe you can and you're halfway there. In fact, my favourite one isn't on here. My favourite one is Nelson Mandela. It always feels impossible until it's done. So, the company Interface, who makes flooring, wanted to find out whether scientists and climate activists and climate experts are looking upwards or downwards. And they asked, do you believe we can take back our climate and make a climate fit for life? And of the 400 scientists and experts they asked around the world, 95% of them said, yes, it's difficult, but possible. That's been my experience as well of dealing with climate scientists around the world. Despite being the people who have access to exactly how fucked everything is, I'm allowed to say that it's cute when British people swear. You've been told. Despite knowing this data more intimately than any of us do, they actually generally, as a group, feel that it is possible for us still to come out of this, as Professor Rockstrom presented to us. However, when I looked at that statistic, that 95% of these scientists and experts think that it is difficult but possible, that wasn't my experience of talking to people every day. And so last year, we surveyed the world population. So we surveyed 21,000 people in 26 countries to ask them whether they think we can solve climate change or reduce climate change. Now, 4% of them worldwide were deniers. They're very loud. They're very overrepresented in comments on newspaper articles. There's one of them in the White House. But they only represent 4% of the global population. Now that goes up and down in different demographics, in different countries and different age groups, but overall a very small percentage. 16% of your fellow human beings actually are very strong optimists. They believe we can, i.e. we have the technology, we have the physical ability to reduce climate change, and we will. 40%, the majority, think we can, we have the technology, and we might. Quite optimistic about technology, not quite so optimistic about humanity and whether we've got the mindset. But overall, that's a very significant proportion of the world population who feels the same way as the climate scientists. And in fact, they're very strongly represented in the global south. In China, in Mexico, in South Africa, in Sweden. These are some of the most optimistic places in terms of believing that we can reduce climate change. But 20% of people are pessimists. They believe that we have the technology, we could reduce climate change, but we won't because people are crap. These are, should we say, techno-realists, humanity pessimists. I know quite a few of those. My dad is one of them. And so far, this is what I was expecting to see. I was expecting to see a majority, sort of optimistic, but a strong sense of people not being so sure whether we've got what it takes. What shocked me was the percentage of people who are fatalists. 14% of people around the world believe this is it. We can no longer reduce climate change. Now, those fatalists, that fatalistic belief, that we can't do anything about it is called a negative performance belief. The psychologists actually have a word for it. It's actually quite a dangerous emotion. It's quite a dangerous mindset to have. Because if you think we can't do anything, then you don't do anything. This is the kind of belief that prevents any action from taking place. It also is the kind of belief that can lead to antisocial behavior and very negative mental health outcomes. Believing there is no future, that this big monster is coming to get us, is very unhealthy for your well-being. And notice I don't put realists on there. These are emotional states. You can be an optimist realist. You can be a pessimist realist. This isn't about realism, this is about attitude towards what we're facing. And when we looked into that fatalism a little bit more, it got slightly more worrying. 16% of 50 to 64-year-olds agreed that it's too late to stop climate change. 18% of 35 to 49-year-olds and 22% of the under 35s. The people who think we have no future are the people who have more of it than anybody else. And of course, it's our young who think that we can't solve climate change. They've been listening to this since they were children. We've told them the scary story of the monster that's coming to eat their future their whole lives. Now, these aren't the young people who come and work for Futerra. The young people who come to work for Futerra are passionate change makers. They are the strong optimists who believe we can do something. These young people are the silent. They're not on social media talking about fatalism. They just don't care. They've given up. There is no future. And what do you think that's doing to their behaviors and to their beliefs and to their mental health? In some countries, this statistic is even higher. In the United States, it's up at 30%. 30% of young people believing that we can no longer take action on climate change. And of course, when we ask people, do you hear more about the negative impacts of climate change, or do you hear more about progress and solutions? Of course, people are hearing more about the problem than about the solution. You are all going to die is much more the message that we hear. It's the more interesting message for the media than, hey, look at this really cool thing you can do with food or with technology or in your life or in your home. The scary story sells. The solution story, not so much. So, as Futerra, we decided to start a campaign on this, the Climate Optimist campaign. It was launched in New York last year. Just trying to get out there that message that solving climate change must start with the belief that we can. If we don't believe our actions are going to make any difference, we're not going to take them. We made some kooky messaging. We brought in some real strong proof points around concrete that's being made by drawn down carbon, about the fact that we can reuse coffee grounds for fuel, the fact that solar has become price parity with fossil fuels. It's been a really successful campaign. We've managed to engage a lot of young people around the world. But what they all asked was, well, what can I do? With these messages, you're telling me what's going on in the outside world. But what can I do? And this is where things get interesting. Because if you think about the feedback loop between what I was saying around positivity and action, something interesting happens. And this is my book, The Happy Hero. In fact, most of this has been in my book, The Happy Hero. In The Happy Hero, I talk about the fact that as individuals, we deserve to feel happy and positive and optimistic about the future. Being positive and optimistic is good for you. People who are positive and optimistic about the future are more likely to live longer, are less likely to get ill, have more and wider groups of friends, and have a better sex life. That's not personal anecdote, that's the scientific research. Being positive and optimistic about the future is good for you as an individual. In fact, it's very bad for you to be the opposite. But we also need to take action. This is where the heroism piece comes in. To take action in your own personal life makes a real difference. And it also creates a feedback loop with your positivity. The more positive you are, the more likely you are to take action. The more you take action, the more positive you're likely to be. So those two sides, that necessity, as that I explained at the crossroads, that absolute necessity in the crisis curve for us to be looking upwards and thinking about how the world's going to get better, and the fact we actually have to do something as individuals. Now, sometimes people question whether doing something is going to make any difference. So I did a bit of research on the UK. I looked at one average day in the UK, and what the average food shopping, car buying, and holiday booking was for that average day. And we did the calculations of if somehow everybody in the UK became Swedish for a day and did all those good things, what would the impact be? And in just one day of the British people changing their behaviour, not doing anything they would do otherwise, not buying more cars or less cars, just the average number of purchases that were made in one day. If they changed to greener purchases, we could turn a coal power station off for a year. We talk a lot about people power, powerful people. We need to talk more about people power. That's the kind of people power impact that we can have through our own personal behaviours. Now, Johan Rockström spoke a lot about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. This incredible to-do list for the planet that has been developed through intense negotiations over a period of time with all the countries in the world. I rewrote them for fun in May of this year, because that's the kind of thing I do for fun. I rewrote them for fun for myself, to think about what are the actions that I could do. I'm a woman, I live in London. What are the kind of actions that I could do in order to help take action on the Sustainable Development Goals? Number one in the Sustainable Development Goals is end poverty. Well, I could buy fair trade. I could use more green energy. I could move and smile more. I could treat everyone equally. I could buy better stuff. Now, in May of this year, I wrote these, and one of my wonderful Futerra colleagues designed them up, and we put them on social media, and they got shared thousands and thousands of times. Hundreds of thousands of people got engaged. And when we published these for fun, two things happened. One half of the United Nations contacted us to say, excuse me, but you've completely infringed the copyright of the UN. Could you stop? That wasn't the exact words they used. Rightly so. Another part of the UN 10-year framework for sustainable production and consumption, which is the 10YFP, which actually is run by the Swedish government and the Japanese government in partnership, came to us and said, let's do this for real. Let's not do this for one woman, a high consumer sitting in London. Let's think about, are there ways that every single human being on this planet, 7.5 billion people, could contribute to making the SDGs a reality? Because bluntly, without 7.5 billion people contributing to making these SDGs a reality, what do we think is going to happen? Do we think that governments and businesses are going to be the ones who affect change rather than individuals? And so between May and just a few weeks ago, Futerra, the One Planet, that's the 10YFP, SCI here in Stockholm, IGES in Japan, UN Environment, WBCSD, UNESCO, etc., gathered together. We pulled in a whole set of experts in order to set good life goals, a set of actions that if we as individuals take them, will measurably contribute to fulfilling the SDGs. And because they're the international language, we created a set of 17 emojis to go with them. Basically, anyone under about 15 only communicates in emojis anyway, so we thought that's where we'd start. These 17 emojis each come with a set of specific asks underneath each one, that some of which are only available to those of us who are over-consumers, but some of which are available to everybody. I'm not going to go through all 17, you'll be pleased to know. I'm just going to flick through to reflect on a couple of them. So, for example, we're speaking a lot today about eat better. And there's been a huge amount of work done on the transformational impact that our diets can have on our own health, on how other people are treated in supply chains, and on the world around us. Every single time you eat something, you get a chance to make a difference in the world. It's actually really kind of cool when you think about that. Every single time you choose to eat something, you're affecting the world around you. And so, very simply, learn how we farm, fish, and make our food. Enjoy more fruits and vegetables. Buy local, seasonal, and fairly traded food. Help children, elderly people, and pregnant women to eat well, and demand an end to global hunger. Each one of these is linked back to one of the measurable targets within the SDGs themselves. Because the SDGs are not just the headlines, there's hard, measurable 2030 targets underneath each one. And so these are linked back through to them. You'll notice later on, we do talk about eating less meat. In this one, we talked about enjoying more fruit and vegetables. Flicking onwards. One of my favourite ones, and one of the ones which has been responded to best around the world, is in Learn and Teach. Number 2, teach kids kindness. How many of the problems in our world would be solved if actually we taught our kids kindness a little bit better? Support teachers and keep schools open. We'll keep going. I wanted to stop on a few of the climate ones. So, use clean energy. This is one of my favourite emojis, by the way. I like this guy. Save energy wherever you can. Buy from companies powered by renewable energy. Demand clean, affordable energy for everyone. You'll notice that these follow a similar structure. The first one is always a learn, because actually educating ourselves, finding out about the world, discovering what the real situation is important. And the final one is always a demand, an ask of powerful people. We don't have the word vote in there because we quite like the idea of these being used in China, but we do have the word demand. And the ones in the middle are of increasing difficulty or of increasing wealth required to do so. It's very important to us in developing these that there is at least some of the asks that are available to people who are on low incomes, whether they're in high or low income countries, but also without removing the added responsibility for those of us on higher incomes to take action with the lifestyles that we've been gifted. I'm just going to flick on through a few of them and just be amused at the wonderful creativity of the emojis. They all animate as well, although a few of them are a bit scary. Live better. Simple things, well, forthright things. Reuse, repair, recycle, share and borrow. Harder things. Collect friends and experiences, not just things. Oh, I don't want to skip I skipped the important one. Act on climate. This is, of the Good Life Goals, the one about which there was probably the most controversy, the most challenging conversations within our UN partners, which I find extraordinary. Because in the most recent IPCC report, it was the first time the IPCC actually included asks for us as individuals. I'm not sure if you've seen that, but the IPCC has actually called on all of us to now take action on climate change. And this is a fundamental difference for how the IPCC has been working up until now, where it's been focusing only on policymakers and decision makers. Now it's focusing on all of us as decision makers. And their 5 asks within the Good Life Goals are exactly matched to what the IPCC is calling for. Learn about climate solutions, not learn about climate change. Learn about climate solutions. This is what we should be focusing our energy on. I trust the scientists to track the causes and impacts of climate change in their detail. There's not very much I've got to give to the science on climate change. There's a lot that my actions and my behaviours can contribute to the solution. Call for more renewable energy in your country, eat more plants and cut down on meat, which sounds a little bit sharp, although actually those incredible photographs that we saw before I came on, I almost sort of want those in the background for that question. Walk and cycle rather than drive, and demand leaders take bold climate action today. I'm just going to keep flicking through. That's my favourite one. Love that guy. And then the final one. And I think this is a really important point when I'm sitting here addressing members of a cooperative. I've spoken about how culture changes overall and about individual action. The crisis curve that whole societies can go through and that a single individual can do. But of course, there's something between whole societies and single individuals, and that's communities. Those of us that choose to come together, that might be sitting here tonight next to people who are strangers, except that they're not. When you look around this room, the people in this room hold enough similar values with you that they want to be a member, that they want to be cooperative. And I think that level, that space between how our whole cultures, how our human species operates, and how as we, as atomized single people, are going to take action, that's the exciting space. The space where small and large groups, families, friends, membership organisations, clubs are going to come together and make change. And that might not be what we see reflected in our newspapers. That might not be grand enough or big enough to be spoken about on stages at the United Nations. But that's where real change becomes possible, where we support each other to make those choices, where we decide to back somebody like the Co-op in moving towards more plant-based and away from meat diets, where we help each other out to make the transitions that otherwise might be a bit difficult to do as a single person. So make tomorrow better than today is the final Good Life goal. Make tomorrow better than today. Not save tomorrow from being an absolute fucking disaster. But make tomorrow actually better. Because I don't know about you, but when I look at the children in my family, I don't just want sustainable for them. I actually want better. I want them to have more, not necessarily more things, but more excitement, more hope, more education, more interest, more love. I don't want them to fight and solve my problems. I want to gift them something better than I got, and that is still possible. And we have to hold on to that belief that as individuals, as communities like the community that I see in here, and as the entire planet, we actually have the potential to change the course of that crisis curve. Those of us who are privileged enough to be here and be adults standing at that crossroads, adults able to make the difference that we can in our lives, absolute privilege to be able to make those choices. I just want to show a very quick film just to articulate that better than me with a cold ever could. Tack, thank you very much. It's been an honour to come and speak to you. I'm a bit overawed by how amazing you all are that you've come together to spend an evening learning about this. Tack, thank you so very, very much. And now go out there and save the world.